Yeah, hello? Yes. I just looking across this room, there are very few people here who are not here because I required them to be here, but thank you all for coming. We know that this isn't your typical Sunday afternoon book conversation. But you will, I hope, get enough out of it to know why I think this is a book worth the trouble. The picture in behind me is the cover. And there are three people on that cover. One of them, the one on the left, is my brother Robert. He was 8 at the time. In the middle is Joasha. She's the author. She was 4. And to the right is Richard, Jan Richard Brzozowski. He was 17. He joined the Polish branch of the Royal Air Force, and in 1944, at the age of 22, he was killed in a plane crash. So those three are characters in the book, and they are, in fact, from my mother's family. So what is this? I've been thinking about for a long time. The book, as I said, was published in the early part of the century, won Poland's top literary prize, was translated and published, translated by Antonia, published in the UK, also in Holland, France, Germany. I mean, in other words, it had substantial reach for a book of this kind. I did not publish it at the time, although I'm a publisher. Wait a minute. Publishing a book about my mother's family seemed a bit much. But time has changed that perception. Why? Well, among other things, the book has been around long enough to be a classic. In 2005, without my having anything to do with it, in fact, the guy never talked to me, the New York Times ran a very large feature about the book. Richard Bernstein, Times correspondent. And why? Because he said the book had had extraordinary resonance in Poland and elsewhere. Why? Because of the nature of the family. If you look at the family, the ones that are directly in the book, on one end was the founder of the Citro motor company. On the other end was a very close friend of Lenin's in Zurich. It's a spectrum. It's a range of family background. Most people, 80 years after the end of World War II, when you say, tell me something about Jews in Poland, the most important person in this room has just arrived. That's my grandson, Ollie. Ollie, have a seat. And if you have any questions, I'll answer them. So 80 years after the end of World War II, if you say, tell me something about Jews in Poland, almost always the answer has to do with annihilation, the Holocaust, and the real fuller story of Jews in Poland is much greater than that, and that is where this family comes in. We're tracing the family, this particular part of the family, back to the middle of the 19th century. We're going to show you pictures, and Antonia is going to tell you a bit about each of them. But they were not annihilated in the war. They endured. And in fact, they endured in ways that are a tribute to their brashness, their courage, their luck. But it's an effort to frame the story of the Jewish community in Poland and Central Europe generally much more broadly than it traditionally is now, so that you understand this was not just people who were forced into Auschwitz. These were people with very vibrant, very dynamic, and very successful lives. And somehow, one way or another, including my parents, they made it. Now, why am I particularly interested? Well, not just the fact that it's my parents or my family. But I was born at the very end of what was their odyssey. They were in India, where they were safe. And I was born at the end of the time in India and was brought to the United States in a basket. So I grew up after the dramas of, essentially the dramas of World War II. And by the time I was 5, my parents were already building their first country house, meaning they just got on with it. And I never really had to think much about what they had left behind. 2 things in 1979, by which time I was at the Washington Post, I was then the foreign editor, ignited something for me that I hadn't really appreciated up until then. One was a movie called Image Before My Eyes, which was, at the time, nationally distributed, oddly, a commercial film called Image Before My Eyes about Poland between the wars, Poland's Jews between the wars. And you saw all the predictable pictures, people in the countryside, people being marched off. But then they showed a couple, 2 couples, in an open car, in a convertible. And they looked prosperous and happy and successful. And I turned to my wife, Susan, the nice lady in the yellow, and I said, Suze, I hate to say this, but that was my father in the car. And the next day I called the man who made the movie, the director, and I said, no, look, I'm really embarrassed. But I went to review this film for the Washington Post, and I kind of saw my father. And it was. It was suddenly a kind of Twilight Zone glimpse into their world. They were part of the world of people who were part of Polish society, Polish culture, but were also Jewish, which gave them a different kind of identity, and that's very much part of this book. The second was when Pope John Paul went to Poland in this June of '79, and I went to cover that story. And you could not go to see Pope John Paul in Poland without being immensely moved by Poland, by what that all meant. The entire country, literally without exception, turned out. And I could tell right then that the days of Soviet authority were numbered. So I became more and more interested as a reporter, as a spectator, as a curiosity seeker, and been back and forth to Poland. And we went there when Joasha won the Polish Literary Prize. We went to celebrate with her, and we've been back several times since. She's 90. She's in fine fettle. She lives in Krakow. Her daughter, granddaughter, and 4 of her grandchildren live in the same building. She has written a number of other wonderful works. She has and I think Antonia will be able to tell you about it. She has a marvelous voice, a spirit, which is kind of classically, in its own way, Central European. A little bit of irony, a little bit of humor, a little bit of melancholy. But she tells the story of this amazing family with such clarity and beauty in the wonderful words of Antonia. No one knows the book as well, aside from Joasha, as Antonia. So what I'm going to ask her to do now is tell you some about what is it that makes the book so distinctive? What is it about the book that I think has made it into a classic? And when she's finished with that part of it, we're going to show you the pictures of people in the book and try to tell you something about them. So there, and when we're done at 3:45, you can ask questions, but some of you have already heard so much from me in the past that you may not need to, but there are a few people here who may want to have questions. So anyway, Antonia, please. It's a beautiful, by the way, the translate. Can I brag about you? One of the things about Antonia is that she is one of the leading translators of literature in Polish, including the Nobel laureate, Olga Tokarczuk.
It's a small pool of people who do what I do.
Modesty goes with the territory. So tell us in a way that people can appreciate what it is that this book is and why it is that you and I and so many other people find it significant.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter, for that nice introduction. So this book is a portrait of a family, as Peter has explained. But what really fascinated me about it when I first read it is that it explains what it is and was to be a Jewish Polish person. And people are aware of shtetl life or Orthodox life, and they imagine this kind of rather isolated world of the Jews in Poland before the Second World War that doesn't exist at all now. But in fact, this family, and she takes you back to about the 1860s, and then she takes you through in her account to after the Second World War. They were an assimilated intelligentsia family with all sorts of attributes, highly educated, lots of interests, lots of things happening. And it's the first time I really understood the relationship between Jewish Poles and Polish Poles in that at that class level. We've got terrible echo here, I'm sorry, it's quite distracting. It's like hearing yourself shout at yourself. So what happens at the start of the book, and she's got this very difficult task because she's decided quite late on in life to write this family memoir, but she had all sorts of rather disparate bits of material to work from. So there were members of the family that she knew and could talk to. And there were some whom she didn't know, but came to know in the course of writing the book. And then, as she describes at the end of the book, there were these terrible boxes and bags of all her mother's and grandmother's surviving old letters and bits of paper and all that stuff you think, I can't really quite bring myself to throw this away, but you don't want to look at it. And every time she moved house, she took all these things with her, thinking, well, maybe one day I'll do something with this. And then the right time came. And she explains how, having been a survivor of the Holocaust who was hidden as a child inside altars by nuns, and it's very dramatic what happened to her, but she's very nonchalant about it. But she explains that she simply couldn't face any of the family past for ages. And it took her a very long time to be ready to write this book. It was something she needed to grow towards. And when the right time came, and she started going through all those old papers and then talking to the people she knew in the family and then finding the people beyond that, it all started to fall into place. And there were all sorts of stories that she didn't know were there. She didn't know about Ryszard Bychowski in that detail when she started working on the book. And there's a magic to that. And the real beauty here is that I come across very many Poles who, towards the end of their lives, want to put down the family story in words for their children or grandchildren who perhaps don't speak Polish. And they've all had, every single story of a family in Poland is different, important, and shocking. Everyone. You start talking to people in Poland about what happened to their family in the war, and you will get a fascinating and really quite alarming story. So everyone wants to record them, but not everyone is a brilliant writer. And where she really, really has done something extraordinary is in her way of putting all this material together into something that becomes a real page turner. You want to know what happens next to these people. And she's organized the stories very, very well. So here you are with a family which starts with a couple who have 9 children. And then you get everything that happened to those branches of this family. That's a lot of people to keep in your head and to sort out. And it's quite confusing. But she's very good at not losing you, not letting you feel that you're in the woods. And she's always stopping and analysing things. So she'll stop and ask questions. Why did this person do that at that time? And why certain things were said or done in certain situations. And I like that way of standing back and looking at these people and trying to fill in the gaps of the things she can never really know. And then she's got a wonderful balance of really vivid anecdotes that bring the past to life. She has a way of telling a quite simple little story, and you just never forget it because it's so vivid. And she's also very good at characters. This is a person with an amazing perception about character. You can be in the room with her for 5 minutes and she will see right through.
Unfortunately, that is the case. Her eyebrows are slightly to the right. There's always a sort of slightly ironic glimpse in her face. She looks at you and she gets you. Do not try to put one over on Joasha. That is what, and she has this very distinctive voice, slightly ironic, slightly melancholy, filled with a kind of humor that takes this incredibly complicated family story and renders it as literature.
That's right, absolutely. So it's like reading a novel in a way, reading this book. She's also very good at filling in the bits of history you need, because obviously not all of us are completely au fait with everything that was happening over a 100-year period in that part of Europe. But she just carries you along. And it's one of those books where you feel like you're reading a letter from a friend. It's just so personal and so beautifully written. She tells me she hates adjectives, which may have something to do with it.
Our first two reviews in this country, the two sort of standard places, Publishers Weekly and Kirkus, both describe it as vast, sprawling, and like a great Russian novel, which is to say you have to keep track of the characters. So we've got a character list in the front so you can get, because there are 9 branches of the original family, the first couple, which you're going to see all the pictures of. And each one of them was distinctive. Let me just tell you a bit about the one that was a good friend of Lenin's in Zurich, because you're going to hear a story that most people couldn't tell you. So Camilla, who was one of the 9, decided she was going to be a doctor. Well, a woman and a Jew, it was not going to happen in Warsaw. She went to Zurich. And in Zurich, she became part of the crowd, which included young V.I. Lenin. And in the book, it describes how one day she went to Lenin and said, I need to borrow a bicycle. And Lenin said, well, you can borrow mine, but be careful with it because my bicycle is borrowed also. She took the bicycle and crashed it. And she went back to Lenin and said, I'm sorry, but I have done damage to your bicycle. And he said, what am I going to tell the owners? That's not the usual kind of story you'll hear about Lenin. The grandparents, what in fact were Joasha's grandparents, were as close to the Alfred and Blanche Knopfs of Poland as you could possibly be. They had Poland's most sort of distinguished publishing company and published wonderful, extraordinary array of really established and world famous by the standards of these things, writers. And then there was my grandfather, who you'll see a picture of, who was, among other things, a terrible snob. And since my father's family was perceived not quite as lofty in the intellectual realm because they were mostly people who were in business, every time my father came in courtship to my mother, her father would come out and introduce himself as though he couldn't remember who this fellow was who was coming. So it's a family dynamic. And then comes World War II. And we'll get into a little bit of what happened to each of the families in World War II. But amazingly, the family has endured, and you will see the successors, the descendants, large number of young, engaged, successful people who are directly descended from this family and from this couple that you're about to see. His name is Gustav Horowitz. His father was the chief rabbi of Vienna. But Gustav was a serious and not tremendously ambitious fellow. So it was arranged that he would marry this person, Julia. She came from one of the leading families in Poland in the salt market, which in those years was, equal to gold. Julia and Gustav married. Do you want to say something about the two of them?
They had very different personalities. So Gustav was rather sort of retiring and modest and quiet, and had come from this rabbinical family. And in Vienna, he came from Vienna, and moved to Warsaw on marriage. And
arranged marriage.
Yes. And Julia was one of a whole series of sisters, so they were keen to marry off these girls, but they had plenty of money. And so she had a very different personality from him. She was very determined and very confident. And so they started their married life and had rather rapidly 9 children. They were married in... What year were they married? I'm trying to see. Well, the first child was born in 1868, and the last one in 1881.
6 girls, 3 boys.
Yes. And then Gustav had a fairly minor operation, and in those days, a minor operation would be performed at home, just on the kitchen table or whatever, dining room table, which doesn't sound great to me. And unfortunately, he got an infection and he died. So suddenly, Julia Horvitz was left a widow with 9 children.
He died at 37.
Yes. And so she had to make some decisions. And one of the things that strikes me about this book and about the characters in this family is that obviously life throws you curved balls, and you've got to find ways of dealing with them, or you may end up in political situations where you've got to make some pretty hard decisions. So the first big decision in this book is made by Julia Horvitz when her husband dies, and she decides to drop all the Jewish tradition in the family, make her children speak Polish rather than German or any Yiddish at all anymore, and become as assimilated as possible, because she realized that they were going to have to compete in this difficult society and that they didn't need a religion. So she did away with all the kind of Shabbos and everything, and they lost their Jewish religion. And that was a pretty significant thing, because presumably Gustav would have continued with it.
Well, I guess you should know that Gustav's father, as the chief rabbi of Vienna, it's probably not in the book as explicitly as I could tell you about it, but what his contribution to Jewish history was training mohels to do things surgically rather than with their mouths. And you can see that Julia was formidable. Here are 4 of the 6 women. And from the left, Flora Bailin. Next to her, that is my grandmother, Gisela. Rosa Hilsum and Henrietta Margolis. Each of them were married in ways that were satisfactory, at least in principle, to Julia's requirements. And you can see that they lived a certain kind of life. Hats, they all wore big hats.
There's a lot in the book about clothes.
And they were elegant in a kind of European-facing way. Well, you can tell by looking at them that they were not people in need of help. This is the family on a family holiday. These are the sisters, some of the boys, here again, that is the woman on the second from the left would be my grandmother, and the woman next to her, I guess, would be my mother.
That must be Marta on the left, yes.
Yeah. So you can see, again, this is all in that period before World War I, when the world seemed relatively in some sort of balance. And we all know that with World War I, that balance changed, shifted. And one consequence, of course, was that Poland, after 125 years of being divided up among its neighbors, was allowed to once again become a country. And Poles felt very strongly a sense of nationalism about Poland. But if you were Jewish, it could only go so far. That is my grandfather. And I wish I have that hat. Zygmunt Bochowski, very prominent psychoanalyst, on his way to serve as a general in the 1905, what was the war? Russo-Japanese War. And he later was a neurologist and psychiatrist. He was a contemporary of Freud's. He was sort of more or less equal to Freud in his stature in the early years of psychoanalysis. But as I said, you can tell by looking at him, you wouldn't want to see him in a dark alley if he didn't like you.
Can I ask you a question about
Sure.
that picture that I've been wanting to ask? In the book, it explains that he came from an Orthodox family and he broke away and wanted to become a doctor and kind of buck the trend. And there's Yiddish writing on there. I don't know what it says, but I was just curious that there's something.
I don't know either because my Yiddish is limited.
Sideways on there. If anyone can read it, it'd be interesting to know what it says.
But I've always liked the picture particularly because Ollie is his great-great-grandson. There's a big gap between what that man was and what he believed and what his life was like and where we are in 2025.
You just have to grow a moustache and get a hat.
Yeah, I have to go. This is Camilla. And Camilla was Lenin's very, very good friend. The family cannot prove and would really be horrified to know that I was gossiping about it, that the relationship with Lenin was more than casual. There was a son attributed to a passing Ukrainian soldier. There's no DNA to check. He lived to 104. And there are people in the family who believe that maybe he had something to do with Lenin. That's her. She was, again, one of those extraordinarily formidable. When you look at Julia, you can see what the women of that family were going to be. There is a certain kind of firm ferocity. You want to say something about her?
Well, Camilla's a particularly fascinating character in the book because, as Peter said, there were 6 daughters and 3 sons in this family. But there were 5 girls in a row, then the first boy, Ludwig, then Camilla, then Max, then Stanisław.
Yeah.
And Camilla was in this second half of this group of children. And the older girls, their destiny was going to make those wonderful marriages and wear all those hats and be these kind of ladies, whereas Camilla rebelled totally and utterly, and like her brother Max, who Peter's going to tell you about, they became ardent socialists. Well, first they were involved in the Polish fight for independence. They were very politically active, at great risk and with immense courage and with very firm convictions. And they both ended up becoming communists and ended up in the Soviet Union and had really tragic fates there, in fact, although she survived. But she wanted to be a doctor. And she just kept insisting she was going to go and study in Zurich because it was the only place where women could study medicine. And her mother kept taking her off to the spa towns in the hope that she'd meet some nice young man and forget all about this idiotic idea of becoming a doctor. She sat in the spa hotel reading medical books while her sister was taken out to meet all these young men. She just absolutely adamant, and nobody's going to stop her. I mean, there she was, tending to First World War soldiers, and, well, Lenin apart. It's the first time I've heard that story. She had a child on her own, which is very brave in 1916. She was an absolutely unstoppable force of nature, an admirable woman in all sorts of ways who had a very difficult but fascinating life.
And this is her brother, Maximilian Horowitz. You can see that that is a wanted poster. Max became a really major figure in that Bolshevik crowd, starting in Zurich, where Max was, and spreading across to the Soviet Union, where he was active as a member of the Polish branch of the Communist Party, which meant that you would be accepted for part of the time, and part of the time you would not be, particularly when the Nazi-Soviet pact. That's the picture that was taken of him just before he was executed, 1937. That's his picture. That's Max at the end of his life. And he had a, I would say, complicated relationship with reality. He had more than one family and one set of children. He had a certain set of children, and he kept them apart. One was in Warsaw, one was in Moscow, I think. Max was not an uncomplicated human being, but he certainly had convictions. And that's why he ended up being executed by Stalin in 1937.
He was as hard-headed as a person can be. He was absolutely determined. And it's fascinating in the book. You've only seen a couple of pictures of him, but the earlier pictures, he looks like a romantic young man. And then his story is really one of the most fascinating in the whole book.
On the far right there, with the extraordinary eyes, that's the author, Joasha. She spent much of the war hidden in a convent. Those are other, they're all, in fact, Catholics. No?
5 of them are Jewish.
But there you go. You can tell, just look at her eyes. I've always thought that she had the most extraordinary expression on her face, but that's where she was, in hiding, while the world was in turmoil. And she stayed there until 1945, right? There is a book much of which is taken from In the Garden of Memory. It's called Isaac's Army. It's by Matthew Brzezinski, who was Zbig's nephew, Brzezinski's nephew. And he tells 3 sets of stories in the book. One are the ghetto warriors, all of whom were killed. One is, as it happens, the family of my parents, although I never had anything to do with it. And he tells the story of how they managed to get out. And then the third is people who hid. And that's Joasha's story. So it's, as I think Antonia said, every one of these stories is remarkable in its own terms, but when you aggregate them, it becomes a great literary achievement. That young man, Ollie, your father's middle name is Richard. That's Richard. Richard was the 17-year-old in that picture taken just before the Nazi invasion. He was in Warsaw. His family had evacuated to the east. He stayed, but eventually was persuaded to leave because his father in particular knew that if he stayed, he'd be killed. So they all left. They went eventually across the Soviet Russia and ended up in California, Berkeley. He enrolled at Berkeley. I have his transcripts. I know what he took. I have his papers. I know what he wrote. After a year at Berkeley, he decided that he couldn't really be a student, and he went to Canada and enrolled in the Polish branch of the Royal Air Force. The Polish branch of the Royal Air Force has an extraordinary history. The highest kill rate during the Battle of Britain were Polish fighters. He was 22. He was able to get to a position of senior navigator. And on May 20-something, 1944, on the way back from a bombing run, the plane crashed and he was killed. But by then, he had already left behind an extraordinary amount of his work, his writing, his poetry, his fiction. And I've also, I'll tell you about this website that we've created. He appeared on a radio program called The March of Time, which was the major national radio program during the war. I've always loved the name of the host. His name was Westbrook Van Voorhees. And Time magazine was the sponsor of the program. And after he enlisted, he wrote an article in the New York Times with his byline. So Evan and I have written in other places, but he was, in 1942, he was writing for the New York Times. He was invited to be on that radio broadcast. And we've got the tape. And if you go to our website, which I'll tell you about, you can hear him talk about what it was like to be one of these young men training to fight in the Polish RAF. And his patriotism and his conviction. But the closer we looked, the more we discovered that towards the end of his life, he was deeply hurt and frustrated, because while he was fighting on behalf of Poland, he was dealing with the anti-Semitism and the lack of any empathy from the other Polish fighters in the RAF. And he wrote to his father, a letter to his father, which is a classic, saying, I want to win this war, but I'm not going back to Poland. Not the way these people have dealt with us. You can tell, he's quite a remarkable young man, and his writing was wonderful. His poetry was wonderful. We were talking about this in the car this morning. What would he have done if he'd, hadn't been dead at 22?
Something about him? Because what really strikes me, and there are some pieces of his own writing quoted in the book. I mean, he clearly had immense promise in all sorts of ways, and it's a terrible, terrible loss. But he was a brilliant reporter that he describes trying to get across the border from Poland into Lithuania, which he had to get smuggled himself across what the Poles call a green border. And he describes just the horrors of people being stuck in the woods trying to get across the border and dying out there. And it reminded me, I was rereading this book recently, and I thought, oh my God, that's what's happening on the Poland-Belarus border now. It hasn't changed. And there are so many things, so many echoes in his writing. And he talks about nobody accepting the truth that was brought to London about what was happening in Poland. I mean, he was just a very good chronicler of his times.
And when you read it in real time and you recognize that all of this was happening, and yet somehow the world really couldn't follow, sort of, that great story about what was the guy's name who went to see Felix Frankfurter? Some of you may know the story, Judge Felix Frankfurter. He had come out of Poland and he was determined to tell the truth about what was going on. And he managed to get in an audience with Felix Frankfurter, and he told him what was going on, and Felix Frankfurter said, I don't believe you. I don't think you're lying, but I cannot believe this is happening. All right, this takes you into another realm. We love this picture. This was in the book when it was originally published. Those 5 girls are descendants. Pamela, Asha, Maria, Marta. They are direct descendants of the 9. And this was taken in 2002 when they were, as you can tell, at a certain age and stage. They're now mothers of consequence. This man, I got to stop in a second here. Just read the book. This guy, John Misch was my mother called our savior. He was the man who, when they were desperate, crossing Europe and ended up in Iraq, he guided them to the British embassy, got them passage to India, and showed up in India a year later in British intelligence. He later became the head of all Eastern and South Asian languages at the New York Public Library because he spoke 30 of them. He's less in the book than he is in my heart, but he's perfect for the part. And this is more or less, all I want to do is read to you. How many of you know who the Gabor sisters were? All right. Kardashians of their time, there were three of them. Magda, Eva, and Zsa. Magda was married 6 times. Eva was married 6 times. Zsa was married 8. Magda's first husband had the same name as that young man whose picture you saw, Jan Richard Bashofsky. She decided, Magda did, that the man she had married with this name was insufficiently grand. So she renamed him the Count of Warsaw. Count Jan de Bohofsky. She also claimed that he was a war hero. And when all was said and done, and they divorced, she claimed that he was killed in the plane crash that actually killed our cousin Rish. And there is Count Jan de Bohofsky, husband of Countess Magda Bohofsky, prior to an aerial dogfight, nonsense, against the Nazis. But this is my favorite. This is from a biography of the Gabor sisters published here a few years ago. With delight, Magda, then a newlywed, Polish countess, wrote Jolie, her mother, in Budapest. Nucci, you didn't tell me men have such marvelous plumbing and can do so much with it. That's Magda. Anyway, it was bogus. And how do we know that he was not a war hero? Because in 1960, he wrote a letter to my mother in which he said he was now living in Paris and had an ensuite bathroom. My mother always called him a shoe salesman, which was not a compliment. Anyway, it's a kind of strange wrinkle. And this is last summer's family reunion in Portugal. That's who they are. That's the ones who were able to make it this year. So you can see that for all of the tragedy and for all of the catastrophe of the war period, that's who they are. And that's where I'm supposed to say, please come up and ask any questions you might have and come to the mic and talk into the mic if you have any. And if you don't, I imagine we could keep talking. But the point simply is that every year or so, the family gathers, this European family primarily. This year was in Portugal. And as you can see, the one on the far left here, Nina Hoffman is probably the oldest now. Her father was the one who may have been part of Lenin's family, and so forth. And we have met most of them, but I love just looking at them and knowing what they represent in the history of our family and the world in which we have found ourselves. So that really is the story. Question? Oh, I'm so glad. Come on over, the mic. Well, why don't you come out and ask the question there? Oh, you want to do it from here? You can, sure.
No, there's a microphone.
They're making a video of this, so because we want Joasha in Krakow to see it. You don't have to get up if you don't want to. I'll give you a mic. But first of all, question.
One of the people who came from Poland with the message that was not recognized was Jan Karski. Yes. I'm not sure if he's the man you
that's
were
exactly what
referring to, and he taught at Georgetown later on. If you could print out a copy of the photo with the Yiddish or bring it up on the screen, my wife can read it.
What does she say? What does it say?
Well, she needs to see it. It was. You
stick
have to
around.
print
We'll
it
show
sideways.
it to her. Yeah. All right. It says. It probably says that I'm going to make my putative son-in-law introduce himself every time he comes, because I don't think he's quite that. Anyway, thank you. Dan Morgan, who knows a great deal about that part of the world.
Well, I know more now, thanks to the book. And I have read your Substack piece, which was very helpful, particularly about the last person you talked about. Mish, is it?
Mish, yeah.
Yes, yeah. What a story.
They told me I had to cut it short, so read I'll tell you about the Substack in a minute. Yeah.
I love the book because I am going to read the whole thing, but I love hearing these stories about the kind of Jewish intelligentsia, that existed, and it reminds me a little bit of The Hare with the Golden Eye.
Very much that.
Am I getting that title right, or close at least? Yeah, which is a story about a French family of considerable note, and like this family, it had aristocrats, it had people who were making, assimilated, really well educated, and yet the fascinating question to me is, it was also producing a reaction to this layer of society through the support of the young communist movement, and to me that's fascinating. I wonder what is behind that. Was this an early attempt, early vision of how things were going to swing politically in Europe? Was it maybe just an attempt to kind of assimilate again, but not with the aristocratic class, but with the coming Marxist social movements? I would love to hear what you think about that. Max is executed.
Mm-hmm.
It was definitely partly a reaction to being treated as second-class citizens and not feeling that they could really be full members of society. So in Max's case, for instance, he had known Pilsudski, and they'd been each other's best man at their weddings.
Pilsudski was the Polish president during the interwar period, the great hero.
But he was the great leader of the whole independence movement when Poland was part of the Russian Empire. And several empires, but notably the Russian one. And but then once Poland became independent, Max became more and more socialist, and Pilsudski put him in prison. There's quite a lot in the book about the socialists being imprisoned in the Second Polish Republic in the interwar years. And then, of course, Max got more and more extreme and ended up on the Comintern and ended up being murdered by Stalin. But it was a common thing. There were a lot of Jews of that generation who turned to socialism and further communism in that period. I just translated a book by Mikołaj Łazieński, which is a fictionalized story of his family. And the same thing is there, that several of the children in that family of exactly the same generation became socialists and went off to Russia. And it was definitely a reaction to not being able to be part of this new world that you'd fought for.
Thank you.
Good.
We have a question over here.
Yeah, please.
I have two questions. One, Polish is a really very difficult language to learn. And I am just curious, how did you learn language? Polish well enough to translate books.
I'm guessing you're Polish. You're Polish.
And the second question is, the book was published in English in London in 2005, and I just wonder whether there is any difference between this recent edition which you produced and the old edition. I have both.
The new edition has US spelling and some words that I changed for US English. And what's lovely about the new edition is that it has all the pictures which were in the original Polish edition. Because when Weidenfeld Nicholson published, you've got the UK edition from 2004 there, that one, that they didn't want to put all the pictures in it and they didn't want to feed them into the text. But what Peter's done that's absolutely magnificent is reinstate all the pictures that were in the original book, which is, I was very happy about that because it seemed to me an awful pity the first time. And how did I learn Polish? I was just walking along one day and I fell in a pond and they fished me out and I was talking this funny language and then they threw some other kids in and they just drowned. But no, the truth is that I studied Russian. I come from a family where there's quite a strong interest in languages. I knew as a little kid that I wanted to do languages. That was just innate. And then after I had studied Russian and got a degree in it and spent time in the Soviet Union, etc., cutting a long story short, I went to Poland for the first time during martial law, which was a strange experience. And I could only communicate with my Polish friends in Russian, which was kind of embarrassing and awkward and politically incorrect. So I sat, my best friend there was an agriculture student. So we spent the summer when there was no food in the shops at all, living out in the fields in an old army tent. And we had an old lorry with no engine, a truck with no engine for the cold nights. And I made friends with a dog to use as my blanket. And I sat reading Teach Yourself Polish. And the very first word in this notable publication was kochać, which means to love. And somehow I took that to heart. And I decided that I was going to, actually wanted to be a journalist. I was going to learn Polish properly, and then I was going to tell everyone at home all about what was happening in Poland, because I felt very privileged as an Oxford graduate with the world at my feet. I could really go and do anything. And here were my friends of my age who were looking at having to be in the army and having their lives ruined the way their parents' lives had been ruined, or getting out of the country. They had very little choice, and I wanted to tell people about it.
We have one last question because it's 2 minutes to 4. Antoine, yes, sir.
A quick observation which continues on the theme of languages and a question. The observation is, when I read Substack, and I haven't read the whole book yet, but what you wrote, what struck me was how often being fluent, whether it was German or French or whatever, saved him.
It was, well, my father spoke perfect French.
Yeah.
And when he went to see if he could get a exit visa for my mother in Bucharest, he had a suit made. And he went with a Hamburg and a fancy suit. And he went to the consular section thinking he would maybe be seen by a consulate officer, who took one look at him, heard his French, and sent him to the foreign minister, who said, take care of this man, which gives me the opportunity to say, so the way you publish now, it's not just enough to have a book, because the book will be wonderfully read by a select group of people. So I have written 7 pieces, that's my memoir. 7 pieces on my Substack, which is called Peter Osnos Public Affairs Press, in which I go into some detail. For example, Mr. Misch, who we didn't have time to talk about, I can write about him. And the whole crazy story of cousin Richard and Magda the Count, we call him the Count of no account. Anyway, this is ancillary to the book. The book is the book. And you must all, you're here, which is quite astonishing, that you must read the book, but this other material is also fun to read. And tell people about it, because it's an unusually vivid portrait of a world that, by and large, does not register as it should. There were many people who were not part of the Holocaust, and their stories need to be told as well.
And that really leads me to my question, which is, this is clearly a very unusual family, but how many assimilated Jewish families were there in Poland who really made it to the top of the elite?
They weren't called assimilated in Poland. They were called acculturated.
Well, whatever.
It was a language issue.
Right. Okay.
But it was primarily language. If you spoke the languages of Europe, you were almost certainly acculturated to Europe. The Jews that we know about are the ones who were the shtetls, who primarily Yiddish. One thing is, if you ask, I don't know how many of you have this background, but if you ask most people, most American Jews, to tell you where their ancestors are from, they can't really. Somewhere over there, between Lithuania and Belarus. And that's because for 125 years, it was one huge hodgepodge. So an awful lot of American Jews of that extraction, they don't really know where their families came from. And one of the things we're trying to do with the book is make a connection to the places people came from and the lives they had, which has kind of been lost very largely to history. I think we have to stop because it's at 4 o'clock and we turn
There
into
were a lot.
pumpkins.
And the book will tell you more about it. I mean, but it will also explain how they were never, ever able to just make that step up. And they were always kept in their place, which is tragic.
So thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.